Let's be honest, 2020 was a pretty shitty year in a lot of ways, but one industry that not only continued to truck on through the pandemic, but thrived throughout it, was the games industry. 2020 was both an amazing send-off for the PS4 and Xbox One, and also the start of a promising new generation with the PS5 and Xbox Series S and X. 2020 was an absolutely incredible year for games. In fact, I'd say it's one of my favourite lineups of games ever, so I thought I'd make a video showcasing 15 of my favourite games from last year. Before we dive into the list, I'd like to give a shout out to a handful of honourable mentions that could have potentially been on this list, but I haven't sunk enough time into them to say for sure. Those games are Assassin's Creed Valhalla, Immortals Phoenix Rising, and Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, all of which I've played for about 10 hours and thoroughly enjoyed so far. But as these are all pretty sizable games, at 10 hours I feel like I've only scratched the surface of them. The last game I want to give a nod to is Yakuza Like a Dragon, which I haven't got around to starting yet. I love the Yakuza franchise as well as turn-based RPGs, so I know it's right up my alley, and I'm definitely excited to play it. Now, without further delay, let's get into my top 15 games of 2020. Sackboy A Big Adventure is the most underappreciated title of the PS5 launch lineup. This charming little Big Planet spin-off is one of 2020's best platformers. Sackboy boasts creative level design, a unique art style, and a surprisingly robust soundtrack consisting of both original and licensed music. It's also surprisingly funny, in large part due to its talented voice cast. Sackboy A Big Adventure is also highly replayable thanks to its thoughtful collectibles. Animal Crossing New Horizons could not have launched at a better time. Arriving in the early days of the pandemic, this relaxing and endlessly playable game served as a perfect comfort food title to take our minds off of real-world stressors. It's so easy to lose hours and hours to this game as you collect different fish, bugs and fossils, befriend your island's inhabitants, and tweak your home to perfection. Animal Crossing New Horizons is also a game that continues to offer reasons to revisit your island frequently thanks to its regular updates and in-game events. Marvel's Avengers is in many ways a deeply flawed game, but it's the game I found myself drawn back to most frequently last year. I've put in over 100 hours at this point because I just love the core gameplay. I'm a sucker for loot and grinding in RPGs, so you'd think games like The Division and Destiny would have resonated with me more, and while I did have fun with those games, I also fell off of them very quickly, largely because I wasn't invested in the story and characters presented in them, whereas being a huge comic book nerd, I've already got a pre-existing investment in the cast of the Avengers. I really liked this new interpretation of the Avengers, and thought the story presented in the campaign was surprisingly compelling. While the launch of Avengers was rocky due to a lack of enemy and mission variety, it's mechanically rock solid, with very fun combat that offers a lot of variety thanks to the selection of playable characters that all feel drastically different from one another. The recently released DLC, Taking Aim, has also left me feeling more optimistic about the future of Marvel's Avengers. It introduces a lot of interesting new story threads, and if the care put into bringing Kate Bishop to the game is representative of what we can expect from future DLC characters, I can easily see myself putting well over 100 more hours into Marvel's Avengers. The Crash franchise holds a special place in the hearts of many gamers, myself included, but it's not a franchise that's always been treated with the respect it deserves. After the original trilogy on the PS1, there were a plethora of Crash games that ranged from just okay to downright bad. Thankfully, Crash 4 took the series back to basics, delivering a game that not only successfully recaptures the magic of the original Crash trilogy, but improves on those games in many meaningful ways. Crash 4 pays respect to what came before it without feeling like it's trapped in the past. Excellent level design, unique new powers that give added depth to the gameplay, and a perfectly balanced difficulty level that's regularly challenging but always fair make Crash 4 the best Crash game yet. As a lifelong Dragon Ball fan, an action RPG covering the entirety of the Dragon Ball Z saga is kind of a dream come true. While Kakarot is certainly not the best game on this list from an objective standpoint, I had such a great time exploring this universe that I've loved for almost my whole life. The combat, while fairly simple, is satisfying and fittingly flashy, and the game does a pretty good job of implementing its RPG mechanics to make you feel the character's power levels growing as the story progresses. Kakarot offers a pretty faithful and fleshed out retelling of the Dragon Ball Z saga, with the main story taking about 30 hours to complete, making it a really great way to re-experience the story of Dragon Ball Z without committing to a full rewatch of the anime. After playing over 50 hours of Cyberpunk, I've got to say I really love this game, and I think I've gotten so much enjoyment out of it for two main reasons. The first one being that my expectations were never as high for this game as many other people's were. I was never expecting this to be some revolutionary title that changed video games forever. I was simply expecting a great RPG experience, and Cyberpunk delivered that for me. The second reason I was able to have so much fun with Cyberpunk was honestly that I've just been lucky so far and haven't encountered anything remotely game-breaking in terms of bugs. While it's entirely unacceptable for Cyberpunk's last-gen versions to launch in the state they did, and people's frustration is completely justified, it's a shame to see these piss-poor versions dragging down what is actually a really great RPG that offers excellent world building and one of the most stylish and vibrant video game settings with Night City. The gameplay in Cyberpunk is also awesome. A lot of the time, the combat in first-person RPGs ends up feeling pretty rough, which is something that's always been an issue with Bethesda games. But the gunplay in Cyberpunk is tight and responsive, and the game lets you customize your playstyle a lot through both your unlockable skills and the body modifications you can have implanted into V. I'm not usually the biggest fan of the Cyberpunk aesthetic, but this game really pulled me into its world, and it's a world I'm eager to revisit as Cyberpunk continues to improve and expand. Astros Playroom is not only a very good platformer, but also a nostalgia-fueled love letter to the history of PlayStation. Each level is packed to the brim with Easter eggs referencing some of the best games available on the 4 prior PlayStation consoles, as well as the PSP and Vita. Astros Playroom is also the best showcase of the unique experiences offered by the DualSense controller's haptic feedback and adaptive triggers, which are among the most next-gen feeling aspects of the PS5. Astros Playroom is the best packing game in recent memory as it demonstrates the potential of the PS5's new features while also being an excellent platformer in its own right. Resident Evil 3 is another game that I think is a little underappreciated. While some players were critical of the game's short length, it really didn't bother me, because Resident Evil 3 offers so much replay value thanks to its assortment of unlockable weapons, costumes, and perks. There are also different difficulties that are only unlocked when you complete the game on the prior difficulty. While your first playthrough of the game will likely take around 5 hours, I spent over 20 hours with Resident Evil 3 as I pursued the Platinum Trophy. While Resi 3 doesn't quite hit the highs of Resident Evil 2's stellar remake, it's still an incredibly satisfying action horror experience that introduces some clever additions to the gameplay that give Resident Evil 3 a more fluid feel than its predecessor. The big improvement coming in the form of the dodge button. Narrowly dodging out of the way of a lunging zombie or barely avoiding a swipe from one of the menacing hunters makes you feel like a badass. A benefit of the shorter runtime of Resident Evil 3 is that the game has impeccable pacing. Once things get going, it's a non-stop rollercoaster ride that never lets up until the ending. I really appreciate the way that Resident Evil 3 manages to implement more action-heavy gameplay into the franchise without losing the core identity and spirit of Resident Evil, which is something that later titles like Resident Evil 6 really struggled with. Now that the dust has settled, I think I can comfortably say that Doom Eternal is my favourite shooter ever. The fast and frenetic gameplay offers an incredible sense of momentum unlike anything found in any other FPS. When things really start ramping up in Doom Eternal, you find yourself in an almost rhythmic state, as you rapidly alternate between dashing, shooting, and switching between your sizable arsenal of weapons on the fly. I'd also be remiss to not call attention to the phenomenal soundtrack found in Doom Eternal. The blaring metal perfectly complements the chaos ensuing on screen. Doom Eternal also managed to improve on the already rock-solid foundation laid by its predecessor in a lot of notable ways. The level design is way more interesting and varied, the traversal feels far more fluid, and there are over twice as many enemy types in Doom Eternal than there were in Doom 2016, meaning that combat feels a lot more varied now. Doom Eternal is a gold standard example of how to do a sequel right. There's no feeling quite as gratifying in a game than the feeling you get after slaying a boss in a From Software game. Equal parts unforgiving and rewarding, there's nothing else quite like the Soulsborne genre. In fact, I'd say it's one of my favourite genres, with Dark Souls and Bloodborne being among my favourite games ever. Demon's Souls was the original game that pioneered this genre over a decade ago, and this remake from Bluepoint is the definitive way to experience this grueling adventure. It feels better to play than ever thanks to the introduction of omnidirectional rolling and a much improved camera that removes a lot of the wonkiness found in the PS3 version. Demon's Souls is also the most graphically impressive next-gen title I've played yet. The gorgeous environments and lighting found in the remake help to add to the oppressive atmosphere of Demon's Souls, and the creature design remains top-notch, with the monstrosities found across the nightmarish world of Demon's Souls being among the most memorable in the realm of gaming. Demon's Souls' non-linear nature also helps keep the game from getting too frustrating. When you hit a point where you're banging your head against the wall and getting frustrated, you more often than not can simply go explore another area, strengthen your character and weapons, and come back when you're feeling more confident. Marvel's Spider-Man is one of the greatest superhero games of all time, so it speaks to just how good Spider-Man Miles Morales is that it not only met the quality of that game, but exceeded it in a lot of areas. Miles Morales takes the already outstanding gameplay of Marvel's Spider-Man and further improves it with the inclusion of Miles' unique repertoire of powers. Introducing the ability to turn invisible further enhances the stealth mechanics, and the inclusion of Miles' venom attacks adds an additional layer of depth to the combat. Web slinging also remains as fun as ever. In fact, I think it's the most satisfying form of traversal in video games, period. Something Marvel's Spider-Man did that I really liked was give us new interpretations of familiar Spider-Man villains, and Miles Morales continued this trend by giving us an entirely new version of the Tinkerer. This new Tinkerer is one of the best parts of Miles Morales, and is by far the most interesting take on the character that I've ever seen. The side missions in Miles Morales are also far better than the ones found in the original game. They have a more intimate feeling as they let you see Miles doing some smaller scale tasks that let him interact with the citizens of New York who he's ultimately always working to protect. The Christmas setting and snow-covered version of the map also go a long way to differentiate the feeling of this game from Marvel's Spider-Man. Miles Morales is one of Marvel's most interesting characters in the comics, so it's awesome to see him being introduced to an even wider audience through not only Into the Spider-Verse, but also these Insomniac games. Supergiant Games have been one of the most consistently impressive indie studios, releasing Bastion, Transistor, Pyre, and now Hades within the past decade, all of which were met with near universal praise. So with such an impressive track record, it speaks to how special of a game Hades is that many players, myself included, consider Hades their best game by a mile. This extremely addictive roguelike has near endless replayability, taking the already high bar set by games like Spelunky, Rogue Legacy and The Binding of Isaac, and raising it to new heights. With its superb writing, striking art style, and diverse selection of weapons that are somehow all enjoyable to use, Hades is unlike anything else in its genre. Hades is technically a roguelite, as it has permanent perk and weapon unlocks. I prefer this to the more traditional roguelike structure, where you're back to square one each time you die. The fact that you're constantly unlocking new things makes it feel like you're always making progress, and that no run is meaningless, because even if you didn't succeed in escaping the underworld, you've acquired resources to grow stronger, which will hopefully let you get a little further next time. I've always enjoyed Sucker Punch's games, be it the Sly Cooper trilogy or the Infamous franchise, and Ghost of Tsushima is no exception. Ghost of Tsushima represents the biggest leap forward Sucker Punch have made yet, being not only the biggest and most ambitious game they've ever made, but also their best game yet. Ghost's minimalistic UI, serene world, and visceral combat make it stand out in the crowded open world genre. Battles in Ghost of Tsushima are slick and bloody, and the traversal is as fluid as you'd expect from a Sucker Punch game. Ghost of Tsushima also has some of the most unique side activities I've ever encountered in a game, with tasks including following foxes who guide you to shrines, soaking in hot springs while Jin reflects on his thoughts, and composing haikus. These creative and non-violent side activities offer a nice change of pace from the action-heavy missions. Sucker Punch also deserve a lot of credit for their continued support of Ghost of Tsushima, with New Game Plus as well as the substantial addition of the co-op mode Legends releasing after launch at no additional cost. Ghost of Tsushima was one hell of a swan song for the PS4 as its last major exclusive before the launch of the PS5. Final Fantasy VII is one of the most iconic and beloved games of all time, so remaking it is no small task. Upon hearing that this remake was going to be multiple parts, I was immediately apprehensive of how Final Fantasy VII Remake would turn out, but fortunately Square Enix pulled it off. Final Fantasy VII Remake modernises Final Fantasy VII while remaining faithful to the spirit of the original game, and successfully expands the Midgar section of Final Fantasy VII into a fully fledged game in its own right. Gameplay wise, Final Fantasy VII Remake diverges drastically from the original game, ditching the turn-based battle system of the original in favour of a real-time battle system with hints of the original's mechanics sprinkled in. This battle system, with its focus on building up enemies' stagger gauges to make them vulnerable to massive damage, is arguably the best part of Remake, and one of the best JRPG combat systems I've ever come across. One of the things that made so many players fall in love with Final Fantasy VII the first time around was its cast of characters, and in Final Fantasy VII Remake, the cast are better than ever. Characters like Cloud, Barret, Aerith, Tifa and Sephiroth have all been updated to feel a little more modern, but remain as likeable and compelling as ever, and side characters like Jessie, who only played a very small part in the original game, have been significantly fleshed out in Remake, making them feel as important to the overarching story as the core cast. The iconic soundtrack of Final Fantasy VII of course also returns in Remake. This is one of the best soundtracks in the Final Fantasy franchise, and it sounds better than ever here. Final Fantasy VII Remake is also one of 2020's most notable games in terms of graphics. Character models are remarkably detailed, and Remake features some of 2020's best environment design. Getting to see some of Final Fantasy VII's most iconic locations recreated with such love and care was especially exciting. The Last of Us is among my favourite games ever. I loved the emotional gut punch of that game's ending, and was unsure if I ever wanted a sequel. However, after playing through Part 2, I was so glad we got one. The Last of Us Part 2 somehow managed to exceed my sky-high expectations for it, delivering one of the most powerful, gut-wrenching, and impactful stories I've ever experienced. This heartbreaking cautionary tale of the toll that hatred takes on a person and the people around them is something I still think about almost daily, 6 months after finishing it, and it's one of the only video games that's ever actually made me contemplate and feel remorse for the heinous acts of violence I committed whilst playing it. The bold and unapologetic writing of The Last of Us Part 2 is elevated even further by the brilliant performances, with Ashley Johnson and Laura Bailey delivering two of the best performances ever seen in a video game as Ellie and Abby. The degree of polish in The Last of Us Part 2 is unparalleled. The lighting and particle effects are ridiculously impressive, and the performance capture is the best I've ever seen in a game. It's truly unbelievable that Naughty Dog got this game running on PS4. The sound design in The Last of Us Part 2 is also flawless, and helps add to the tension of the game, and the spectacular score masterfully complements the moody atmosphere of the game while remaining subtle enough to never be distracting. The implementation of music into the gameplay with Ellie playing the guitar at certain points provides some of The Last of Us Part 2's most emotional moments. The gameplay in The Last of Us Part 2 is also a huge step forward from the first game, with more intricate level design allowing for more interesting encounters with enemies, and the larger selection of both melee and ranged weapons allows for more options in tackling fights, and keeps combat feeling fresh throughout The Last of Us Part 2's 25-hour campaign. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, you can check out the countless reviews on my channel, including reviews for several of the games on this very list. And make sure to stay tuned for my next video, in which I'll be discussing some of my most anticipated titles of 2021.